it can feel almost impossible to advocate for yourself when you have felt like you have been trampled on. We're going to help you fix that today.
And you can't collaborate in this world at large. You cannot not get trampled on without you in the equation.
Hey, everybody, it's Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Emilia. Today, we have an episode all about how to advocate for yourself and maybe what you're not doing right to really help yourself get ahead or advance or do the thing that you want to do in this world. So by the end of this episode, Bianca, what do we want to make sure that our listeners are walking away, scrolling away, fluttering away from this episode with?
By the end of this episode, you are going to have a little bit more of a deeper understanding of why it's been so hard for you to advocate, and then some things that you can start doing today to help yourself, to advocate, to speak up, to have your voice actually heard. Goodness forbid. I was with a client on, what day is today? Today's Saturday. This was actually yesterday. So I'm with a client and he has a pretty extensive trauma history, which a lot of people are like, men don't have trauma. That's
Think
not true.
Again.
Yeah. Men have a lot of trauma, a lot more than we like to acknowledge, sadly. And this client was a actual failure to thrive baby. So he had significant health complications as an infant. And he grew up in a home where his mother was an alcoholic and his father was very physically, emotionally, and verbally abusive. And then he just ended up being abused by both parents. And they went without food for days and weeks on end. He went to school and was bullied at school because he was the weird one. Then his sister started bullying him when they got older. And it just became this really terrible cycle of harm and abuse. So obviously, what happens when all you know is harm and all you know is abuse? You end up getting into relationships where that cycle perpetuates and where that cycle continues. He was physically, emotionally, psychologically abused in many of the relationships with women that he was in. And now he's in his 30s and he feels like he has no voice. Like the world is completely against him and there's really nothing he can do. And so the situation came up where he's at school. His teacher was being very, to use his words, very dodgy. So she was out like 90% of the semester, wouldn't respond to anyone's emails. He was asking to be able to do extra work and if there's anything more that he can do. And she was cutting him down, saying, I don't give extra work. And she basically flunked his final exam without giving him any reason as to why, didn't grade it, nothing, just flunked it.
Oh, we love horrible professors.
Oh yeah, very, very much an abuse of power.
Yeah.
So now he's like, well, I had an A. Now I have like a C.
Jeez.
I don't know what to do. And because of his history, he doesn't believe that there's anything he can do. He's just going to have to deal with it ultimately and move on because that's been his entire life story. So me being the therapist that I am, I said, what would it be like to try to advocate for yourself and to speak up? Emilia, you ever have those sessions with a client where you say something they've never thought before and it feels so outside of the realm of possibility that they just completely like shut off?
I had one last night when I talked about cutting the cord of mom and dad paying for someone's bills forever. totally shut off ever since. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Create some necessity. What? Can't cut that umbilical cord. Yeah, for sure. 100%.
He was so much in a dorsal collapse, to use polyvagal language, completely shut down. Couldn't sit in the conversation anymore, because the idea of speaking up for himself, the idea of advocating for himself and not allowing someone to treat him terribly was absolutely terrifying to him. Now, this is not a unique scenario. His story is unique to him and his life and his circumstances, but so many people go through life feeling as though they have no voice. They cannot advocate. They are not able to be a real person. Like right before we hit record on this, I was on a call with another client another man, in a very similar thing. And anytime he does try to use his voice, it's thrown in his face that, oh, well, you have mental problems because you're in therapy and that's why you're bringing this stuff up. It's a very alarming and a very sad reality that very few people ever actually learn how to advocate, how to use their voice. And it causes so much harm.
Yeah, it really does. When you think about the experiences that people have had, I want everyone to envision, it's that classic, you have a pole in the ground and a chain attached to it. And that chain is about 10 feet long, right? Metal chain. And I want you to imagine on the other end of that is this metal collar, for lack of better words. Now, this collar is big enough to fit around an elephant's neck. Now imagine, and I'm not for animal cruelty at all, but it's that classic example, whether it's an elephant or a wolf or a shark in a fish tank or a fish, whatever. Like this principle is true, where imagine your entire life, you're hooked up to this quote unquote chain and you can only go so far. And in the human version of this is every single time I try to speak up or use my voice or even be a person and take up any space, there's a consequence, and it's really painful and it's hurtful, and literally neurochemically it registers as pain. The elephant that constantly is on a chain tugging so much feels that pain every single time they try to get away from that chain. And so eventually they just walk in circles and circles and circles. And eventually when they take that quote unquote chain off, that elephant isn't even registering that they're quote unquote free, right? Just like humans, when they are 30 years old, this person is a great example. Unfortunately, there's more common experiences like this than there are to the contrary, where people, men, women, so many different age groups feel like their voice is not heard and that there is going to be a negative or painful consequence if in fact they do actually speak up. So when there is an opportunity, like Bianca, you had given that person in real time in session, what would advocating for yourself actually feel like? Instead of recognizing that there's freedom in that, instead of recognizing that, oh, right, I do have a voice and it does matter and I am a human being and this abuse of power is not okay. Your brain doesn't even go to that quote unquote freedom. Picture the elephant without the chain, realizing it can go wherever it wants. It just registers that is dangerous. Every single time that I've done that feels like pain. Do not do that or else there's consequences. And so by the time you're 30 years old in a situation like this, or maybe less intense, the first thought that you have is that's impossible. It's not worth it. I shouldn't even try. And so that self-defeating narrative becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then what do? You don't do anything about it. And so I think the opportunity that you gave that client was actually a really important one, because in that chair, you gave that person a moment for just even a second in this imaginary quote unquote world to simulate what that feeling could be like without actually being in the throngs of the quote unquote threat in a safe therapeutic environment, what would it feel like to self-advocate? You gave him that opportunity to even just go for a second into what freedom and liberty and self-advocacy looks and feels like. And so in real time, he is putting back online, for lack of better words, the components of his brain, the components of his thought process, the components of what it means to be a person, and realize that you have a voice and it matters, which if you're a failure to thrive baby and that has been your set of experiences, it's going to feel like literally a whole new set of legs. It's going to feel completely foreign to your experiences. And I'm sure that's what it was like for him. And so whether it be him or whether it be someone else, that safe container, that safe space, that safe simulation is so radically important in the process of learning how to advocate for yourself, because of the fact that it is a low risk scenario with a high reward of producing that skill set of just even imagining what life could be like if you were to role play or simulate advocacy. And oftentimes, more often than not, if you're in that bucket and you're listening to this episode and you're like, yeah, I actually suck at self-advocating. I actually suck at speaking up for my needs. I'm terrified even hearing this guy's story. Or maybe you've been there and you've had some stuff like this happen to you. Like, it is unfortunately more common than we'd like to admit. What is less common is realizing that your voice matters regardless of your experiences. That's so hard to separate. Your skill set developing self-advocacy is actually so necessary for this world to become a better place, for your world to be a better world. And it's actually critical. It's a critical skill that is a life skill, because without self-advocacy, like I said in the beginning, you cannot functionally and adaptively be in this world that will chew you up and spit you out. Like, you cannot function in it without you in it. Like, you are in it, and you forget that you are so much more capable than the set of experiences that you've had are telling you in the moment where you could self-advocate.
So let's start off with a definition in shared language. What is self-advocacy? What are the components of it?
I thought the same thing just a second ago. Love that.
Twin,
okay.
Where have you been? Nobody.
Hey. Don't know the song.
Oh.
Love it. Is that like a Lizzie McGuire thing? I don't know why my brain just... Okay. All right. Never mind. All right. So where do we start? Share definition. Okay. Well, let's look at advocacy, or to advocate, right? The verb to advocate. If we break down in the most fundamental principle of what to advocate means, it is a verb, meaning there is a process by which you engage in order, quote unquote, to do something. And that doing something, from my perspective, is to hold within your mind's eye, yourself, etc., or whoever is the advocate, right? There's a person who's an advocate, and then to advocate is that process by which that advocate engages upon. There's a cause or something you value, and you are engaging in the process of advocating, which is pretty much arguing for what you believe in. Arguing or taking a stance, and publicly taking that stance such that someone else is aware of what your stance is. So if I were to advocate for animal rights, I would make sure that when I talk about actual animal abuse, I make sure that I'm advocating against animal abuse, because I don't believe in that. So don't you dare tie up an elephant or an animal and let them walk in circles. And don't you dare, as a parent, do the equivalent of that to your child. As an advocate, you know where my beliefs stem from. You know I deeply believe it is important as all hell to publicly make everyone aware of how important that is. So that is publicly making it known what you deeply believe in or what you value.
It also doesn't have to be in that grand scale of a scale, like that grand of a scale. Self-advocacy is in the small micro moments with self, or to the extreme, advocating on a public platform your thoughts, feelings, and beliefs.
100%. And so what I was just saying was, what is an advocate? And to advocate is that process. Now, when we look at the self, that's where what you just brought in. The self is anything that you, pertaining to what you value in you, your beliefs, your morals, your ethics, your desires, your moralities, whatever it is in the self, and you advocate for that. So yes, absolutely. Small scale. So this is self-advocating for yourself can look like as small as choosing more helpful, empowering thoughts. That's still self-advocacy. It could look like making the promises and keeping the promises that you make to yourself. And people may or may not necessarily register that, but that's self-advocacy. But specifically self-advocacy that we're talking about in this context, given this story, is more of that engagement of self and advocating for self in the presence of something or a situation where you feel deeply that your voice is being squashed or you're not being heard, or someone is abusing their quote unquote power, right? Whatever it is that you believe you want to, if you do not self-advocate, in other words, there's going to be quote unquote a consequence. And in this scenario, this story, this case, this person now is going to have a C on their track record when they have had a merit-based A up until this point.
Hello, my name is Bree. So I would say my experience at Evolve has been absolutely amazing. I have learned and grown and done so many things that I didn't imagine that I'd be doing just over a year ago. So I'm really happy to be a part of the team, and I encourage anyone who has the opportunity to join. This is an experience that I don't think I would have gotten anywhere else. So it's definitely unique, and there's so many like-minded people, whether it's on the team or in our community, that can be by your side and support you. So that is an awesome experience.
Do you believe that that's the primary reason why people don't advocate, is because of fear of what others will do? Or is it more nuanced than that?
I always see things in more nuance, but I would say absolutely high level fear eats them alive. Again, it's that analogy of my past experience has equaled pain, or something horrible has happened to me. And so what's going to be any different about this experience? I'm better off. How do you tell the difference?
I'm sorry, I thought you were finished.
I was just going to say, you're better off not trying than it is to try and then experience, quote unquote, the pain afterwards, because trying is painful, quote unquote.
Right. I guess relatively briefly, how does someone tell the difference between when it is a situation where it's perceived threat, like this individual, because there's no real threat that can be done to him. What is the teacher going to do? Get up and hit him? Like, there's no real threat physically, or in the ways in which he has experienced harm. That will not happen here.
Right.
So how does someone tell the difference between perceived threat versus real threat? Because sometimes there is a real threat. Sometimes
For sure.
You should not say a word because there is actual danger that could be happening. So briefly, before we move forward into the how-to, how does someone tell the difference?
I think you just articulated it actually quite well. And I think rationality actually comes in this equation and incredibly important. So meaning, what is the probability or what is the likelihood that I'm actually going to be in a physical harm or in physical danger, or whatever, if not physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, I don't know, whatever,
financial,
right? Like
whatever.
actual, there's an immediate implication that's going to have lasting negative consequences on you. And so if you're in quote unquote harm's way, and that's the highest probability, that's the highest likelihood, then your brain's doing its thing, right? Like, shh, okay, quiet, because that teacher has been known to pick up his or her ruler and slap people across the face, right? Like, what's the probability? Kind of high. But if that's not the case, because of the fact that you have zero evidence from that unique person that they would engage in such a behavior, or your set of experiences say, professor actually does have there are consequences if they would engage in said behaviors. We know abuse of power at this school is not quote unquote supported, right? Like if you take into all of that into account in terms of a rational thought and engaging in logic-based thought or reasoning, then it is safe to deduce or realize that the likelihood that you're an actual immediate threat that will have long-term lasting implications on you as someone who is sounding the alarm to something that likely an institution would not like to have continue, then the likelihood is going to be really low. The probability of threat is going to be really low. So I inherently, as a scientist, come from that angle.
Yeah. Sometimes there is actual harm that is going to happen, but the other side of the coin is you are perceiving it as you have a low chance of being able to cope with the situation as well. So for example, my client, another client, the other one that I had mentioned, he said that there have been situations where when he actually did finally advocate for himself and his family, they just cut him off and stopped talking to him. Mm-hmm. And I said, that is the absolute definition of conditional love and a conditional relationship. We will comply with you to the degree, or we will relate to you to the degree that you comply with the role that we have put you in. Now, in some situations, that is going to be the case. If you speak up for yourself, there is the reality that a partner might leave you or family might stop talking to you. The other question that you have to ask is, okay, if there is an actual threat, am I minimizing the fact that I can cope with this? Am I having an increased belief that I cannot cope? Mm-hmm. Because that's another reason why people will not advocate for themselves. You don't believe that you can handle it.
So they confuse their level of coping with their actual assessment of what's going to happen, in other words?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, what real danger is there going to be if your parents stop talking to you because you finally said, I need you to stop talking to me like that? I'm not okay with you communicating to me that way. If they stop talking to you, is there real danger in there? No. Are you going to be able to navigate that and cope with that? Yes. So we get mixed up in our minds about what the real perceived threat of a situation is and our ability to handle it, which is another big reason why we don't cope. I mean, why we don't advocate.
So big distinction there. We have a perception of what the threat or the harm that will come. And this is where anxiety is really good at kind of creating these scenarios. And then we have the reality of the threat or harm that will come if you do self-advocate. This is where the reality is what the logic-based deduction that I was talking about. The perception is that quote unquote judgment without necessarily the logic, the reasoning in it, right? The probabilistic thinking, the likelihood thinking. So big distinction there, because more often than not, yes, our perception of the threat and then our perception of the ability to cope with said quote unquote threat, those end up fusing before we even can distinguish whether or not it is quote unquote worth it. It's the worth it factor of you advocating for yourself. So let's say, for example, you now are kind of shifting over to, oh, whoa, okay, my brain's going to what's the worst that would happen, and which most people do, right? That's the cognitive distortion. You catastrophize. You start going into only seeing the worst case scenario and everything. I love the question, what's the best thing that could happen here? And I think that that's actually so important for when you're kind of going between the logic-based and rational reasoning, as opposed to the perception of said threat or harm that's going to come your way in the near future or immediate future. Once we go through that.
Is that a starting point?
Yes, I would say what's the best that could happen? that is one of the first things that I would encourage everyone to ask themselves when it comes to people who struggle with self-advocacy. Because at the end of the day, like I said, and like we talked about at the very beginning, likely your brain isn't even thinking that. It's shutting down that level type of thinking of the realm of possibility of any good coming out of this. And so instead of doing best, worst, most probable scenario, your brain is just automatically going to worst case scenario, shut down, okay, don't advocate. So what we were just talking about is most probable. But now I'm asking and encouraging everyone to say, what is the best that could happen here? So you go through that thought exercise. Okay, well, maybe this professor, actually comes to the table and says, you know what? I'm so sorry. You're absolutely right. I've been abusing my power. And I don't think that this is fair. I haven't given you any feedback. Let me reevaluate everything and let me give you an accurate assessment based on my ownership because I'm abusing my power, right? Best case scenario. Boom. Then you have brownie points. You know what? Thank you so much for illuminating this to my attention. I'm going to make sure that I give everyone 10 points in their grade because I realized if I was doing this to you, I probably was doing it to everyone. You know what? I'm also going to turn myself in and best case scenario, right?
No, that's Delulu case scenario at that point.
Fair. All right. Best case scenario, one of something in there. All right. Now, how do you take the most probable? And that's where that thinking of what is the most likely based on the best, based on the worst, and kind of in between that, you'll find 5. So the first step of what you're doing, asking that question, what's the best thing that could happen, is ultimately the number one skill in order to advocate for yourself, which is self-awareness. If you do not recognize that your brain, that is the representation of what you're going through, to have self-awareness, that your brain is automatically going to worst case scenario, and you're literally flexing that skill of what's the best case scenario so that you have more self-awareness of what are all the realm of possibilities that also could be in this equation if I were to speak up for myself, if I were to advocate for myself. So step number 1 is increasing self-awareness, engaging with that, and then ultimately understanding, there's a little bit of a different scenario that I could draw up if I were to give my mind this opportunity to kind of like stretch out and understand. So yeah, step number 1 is raise your self-awareness by asking the question, what is the best case scenario here? Boom.
Okay. So what's the best case? My mind is already automatically going to go to what's the worst case. Mm-hmm. And then let's look at what's the most probable and have a little bit of a if then for each. What comes next?
So what I would say is most people actually who struggle with self-advocacy do so because they're not aware of what their actual needs are. They've spent a whole lifetime suppressing their own needs, that if you were actually to go through that thought experiment, which I'm sure this happened with your client, they would be like, they wouldn't even know what is most important to them and what type of action they would engage with. Why? Because they spent their entire life suppressing their own needs and quote unquote, the voice towards advocating for said need. So, hey, I'm thirsty. Okay, need some water. That level of need, of hydration, even that has been suppressed. So the second thing that I would say for people who struggle with self-advocacy is getting extremely clear on what needs that you have, which is why you are self-advocating or feeling that need to in the first place, or your therapist is encouraging you to exercise in the first place. What is the need? And let's do the equal opposite thinking. In other words, if you don't self-advocate, what are the consequences and what needs will be consistently neglected? For that case scenario, the need might be, I actually have a high need for academic standing, because if I don't have that high academic standing, then that's actually going to reduce my chances within a job pool and therefore directly correlate to lower income based on what my career trajectory is. So not only is it a need for academic standing, but it's a need for certainty that if I do not advocate for, and if I don't protect, if I don't speak up about this woman who is abusing power is going to get off on literally like the most important thing, the justice component that is here. and I will have to bear that mark. My needs will forever be neglected, and that has a compound effect down into my future if I don't defend this. A lot of people don't even think about that though. Okay. Last thing is actually like when you actually define what those needs are, and what, in other words, when you're trying to advocate great academic standing, justice, certainty, financial, whatever it is, how do you actually communicate to that person you're trying to advocate with? That is so freaking uncomfortable. We've all done it. Bianca, you and I have done it multiple times. We have to do it based on who we aspire to be.
I'd rather puke in my mouth.
Exactly. I was just going to say it's one of those things that we'd rather do all sorts of things than actually engage upon. Why? Because more often than not, we suck. We suck at it. Just like anything. We expect us to be great at it, but then when we're in the ring, we realize like, oh, no one starts here with great effective communication skills in a way that's like non-violent and non-aggressive. But yet, if I were to look at someone else who's struggling with this and have them go ahead and do it, like I would have grace for them. So the third thing is having grace for yourself to be able to be in the messy middle until you have and cultivate effective communication skills. And obviously this is unique to each person, their scenarios, et cetera, et cetera. If it's professional, it's a little bit different. If it's, intimate relationship or interpersonal, a little bit different, but the principles of effective communication of your needs and what you're trying to advocate for, in other words, argue, is very much the same through and through, right? And I could go into a whole breakdown of that, but that's pretty much it.
Nice. Okay. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I have so many thoughts on this, and I think that I'm going to ground them into truly the invitation for anyone who is struggling. When your voice isn't heard, it is one of the worst things. And it actually does. Science now is showing that suppression of self-advocacy, it literally filters into your bloodstream to the point where your body gets more tense. Even chronic illnesses can be tied back to some of this stuff. And so it's the self-expression is so important. And we're for that when it comes to the arts. But why aren't we so for that when it comes to advocating for our needs? What we deeply believe and value makes sense. Pain. What if there was a world where you could advocate for yourself and maybe others and have the skills to be able to hold the balance when that quote unquote stuff comes down the pipeline? Like, that's a world that I want to live in. That's a world that so many people want to live in. And if you're one of those people that's struggling to make that happen for yourself, please reach out to get help. We do this for so many people, and literally it changes people's lives. So if you're that person, reach out to us. We have got you covered. And in closing, my invitation for you to listen to another episode is 407, the fear of finally using your voice, because it goes a little bit deeper into what that fear is. Bianca?
444, why your deepest insecurities hold the key to your greatest growth. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
And as always, thank you for your interest in the science of holistic mental health. We appreciate you. We're celebrating you, and keep continuing to evolve. We are with you.
Bye everybody.